guys, this is Mikro. We got the monthly balance update, and I wanted to walk through what made it from the dev video to this actual patch itself according to the notes. We'll look later at the data mine and see if that matches up, but I am going to assume for now that everything that they promise here is actually happening, which tends to be the case. And let's hop right into it. So they have some performance changes here. They've implemented a performance chain to the way shaders are loaded in the game, so it should enhance the gameplay by reducing instances of frame hitching and stuttering. But there will be on the actual boot up of the game itself. This will be take a little bit longer. I'm guessing they're just gonna like kind of backload this in the memory from a actual coding perspective. This is gonna make the game faster at the cost of using more memory. That's probably worth the trade-off at this point in the game's lifetime, where most people are capped by frames on their CPU, and everything that you can load into memory will just speed up how fast that you can do those computations with your CPU. So this makes sense. Being a little bit nerdy there, but as a like electrical engineer background, it just makes sense to me, and I deal with this stuff all the time. So it's gonna be like better for obviously it's gonna run faster on an SSD than an HDD, like a hard disk kind of system, but SSD is just generally faster for everything. And if you have your New World on a hard drive, you probably should be moving it to an SSD if you can. I just got an SSD so I could have more room for other games that are coming out, and you can get like 100, or you can get like a 2 TB SSD for under $100 now. So like they're really inexpensive. It took like 5 minutes to install if you kind of know what you're doing. Although that being said, I'm an electrical engineer background, so it's a little bit easier for me. I definitely recommend that, but yeah, if you so this will help a little bit with the actual kind of performance. I don't know if this is going to fix everything. It still feels like we had like a pretty solid 20 to 30 FPS drop in and outside of like wars from the previous patch to the last patch. I'm hoping that they fix some of those issues, but they are on a different branch that they were on season one. Like that's pretty apparent in terms of code structure. So I'm not sure how many of those bugs are going to be caught at this point, and how many they're just going to kind of kick the can and hopefully patched out in season three. Slash in season three, maybe they had a different fork that was maybe off of the season one branch. It's going to run a little bit smoother. I don't really know how that's going to work, but kind of hope for the best here and kind of have to play that one by ear. But this will at least it's a change that they are making to help with the kind of crashing kind of latency problem, which will be good. Combat, they fixed an issue that allowed players to end the recovery blunderbuss ability plague splitting grenade early. Uh, I don't know how I feel about that. I hope this addresses the thing where it doesn't do damage, and they didn't just nerf Blunderbuss more, because Blunderbuss is in a great spot right now. But if they nerf Blunderbuss more, Blunderbuss is probably the worst class in the game overall right now. There are instances where Blunderbuss is good, even if you don't macro it, but it's mostly on like a light super glass cannon oriented blunderbuss. It's sort of like you're playing like the old musket, where you're super glass cannon, but you do like a lot of damage. It's like the same idea, but you're playing in light with the blunderbuss and you're just trying to assassinate people. So I don't know how I feel about that. Blunderbuss is definitely weaker right now. I think there are some companies that still get value out of it. The bugs are you're able to play around them if you know what you're doing. Like the plague splitting grenade, if it doesn't touch a person, it won't bug and it'll do consistent damage. But that means you can't like consistently hit the super grouped up nades that do more burst damage. So overall, I still don't really believe in Blunderbuss fully, but we'll kind of have to see when this gets to live. They've increased the amount of health players gain from the first 150 levels of Constitution attribute points. This is super interesting, along with this like 150 to 300 Dex attribute swap. So I could pull up New World Database and show you guys what that is, but the swap that they're making there is the like the random crit chance, I believe, is the 300 one. It's something that's like generally not super significant, and that 151 is obviously the dodge one. So yeah, 300 is a guaranteed crit after a dodge, can only trigger once after 10 seconds. So this is really interesting to swap earlier, because the 150 dex is honestly like the best part about dex, and everything else after that dex didn't really matter as much. The part that makes this interesting from a game building perspective is this heavily nerfs classes like Disruptor that are reliant on spamming dodges in order to stay alive in positions that they should not be able to play normally with the amount of con that they normally have. That being said, they're just getting a con buff, so they're going to be able to exist here a little bit better, but it's going to feel a little bit more satisfying or a little bit easier to deal with because they're not going to be constantly dodging every single attack that you do, and they can't just out dodge you to win duels, which I think was a major problem because those classes could literally just spam dodge and they would just inherently win duels because they had a stamina advantage. If you traded one for one with stamina, which just made them inherently kind of broken. It kind of puts it in a weird spot where I think Spear is going to be generally a little bit buffed from this because Spear has access to getting stamina back every time they crit. That being said, Cyclone is getting nerfed at the same time, but Cyclone's getting nerfed in terms of damage, not stam regen. So I imagine this puts Spear in a pretty good spot. The other class that this puts in a pretty good spot, weirdly, is Musket. Because now as Musket, you don't have to go for this like 300 dex, 150 int, like 50 con setup, you might be able to get away with like a 150 to 200 dex, 150 int, 150 con, which puts Blunderbuss in a spot where it has access to the damage it needs, but you don't need to over invest in that dexterity category. Do I think Blunderbuss players or do I think Musket players are inherently going to do that at the start of this patch? Probably not, but I think it's possible to use Musket after this patch as more of a kind of space controlling class and not really worrying about like hitting people for 6,000 damage or something stupid like that. But you could hit people for like 4,000, 5,000 damage, which is really good still, and you could be pretty tanky. So I could see this being putting Musket in a pretty good spot. The other thing that this is interesting for Musket is like the Trapper tree, because you could run this Trapper tree as like a more aggro build now. And overall, I just think that puts that class in a really interesting spot. Also puts Rapier in a pretty interesting spot to use offensively because you have guaranteed crits after every dodge, which you could use to proc like I don't know, like a bleed rapier tree and like a PVE build. But that being said, in a PVE build, usually we would have low con anyway, so there's some room to build around this. Overall, this is like a generally a nerf because the stamina is getting reduced, and that's like the best part about 150 dex. That's kind of game changing in a way, and a lot of people try to get to that threshold. But there are some builds that could take advantage of this and get a lot of value off of having that 300 dex passive at the 150 threshold. The actual health threshold, I made a video about that yesterday. I think this will change how people play PvP to a small degree. I think that stuff like Champion's Amulet is arguably very strong next patch because I don't think you really need the extra con that is coming. It is nice to have the extra con, but there's a lot of classes that don't really need access to that. And instead, they could trade that off for doing extra damage, and that extra damage may be worth it for some classes. It's kind of a thing that you should play by feel, but if you have a Champion's Amulet, very easy thing to try. That's probably the best thing to run off the math I did. It's better than doing a slash without the health. For most cases, there are niche cases where if you're like 40, if you have 40 stats into Dex and you want to run like another, or 40 stats into like thrust and you want to run another 10 thrust, then yes, it's better to do that than to use a health versus that one specific attribute. But generally, health is better, and I would say that that's like worth checking out for sure. The Detonate Heart Rune will no longer do critical damage. This is a really, really big nerf, very necessary. A critical damage on the Detonate Heart Rune seemed to bypass Resilient from testing that I did. I believe that was a bug, but it basically made it so Detonate was just chunking people, and it should not have been able to chunk people. This still doesn't fix the double hit Detonate bug that exists in the game, which I hope they fix at some point, but I'm not really sure if they ever will. And Detonate still scales off of Empower, like your actual base Empower, so I think Detonate is still going to be meta until that gets changed. But once that gets changed, which I wouldn't be surprised if it's like a ghost nerf at some point, then I think Detonate will fall off. But for now, Detonate will still reign supreme, even with the critical damage aspect being there, and that even if you take increased damage while you're using Detonate. The only thing that's like changed about Detonate is now people detonate in waves. They don't detonate to counter the detonate. If one team is detonating, the other team backs away. Once that team is done detonating, then the other team goes. This is because if you detonate second, you're going to get hit by the first detonate, and if you get hit by the first detonate, you will be rended when you're hit by that detonate, so it will just inherently do more damage to you, and it's a little bit sketchy. They reduced the strength of Cyclone, the slow on it from 50% to 30%. I don't Oh, I see. I read that wrong the first time, but yeah, they've reduced that a decent amount. Still, honestly, probably a really strong ability. But this is pretty necessary. It felt like it was ability that kind of did everything. They've also limited leeching cyclone to hit only 3 people, so you can't full heal off of that. I think both those are like probably fair changes. It felt like a bit of an overtuned ability. Still very strong though, especially because it gives flat stamina, but it's something that maybe looked at being replaced. That being said, I don't think Perforate is a particularly good ability at the current moment. You can cancel out of it earlier now after the second attack, which is a lot better than it used to be, but I still don't think it's that good. And then they reworked the sword's Achilles heel pass would be a rend. This is the thing where you attacked with an auto and your third attack on an auto would apply a 20% slow. I don't think that this is gonna be a buff overall. I think this is actually a really big nerf to Sword. A lot of people are treating this as like, oh, you're doing this like extra rend now. This could be really good. I think that rend would need to be around 20 to 30% rend for it to actually be like an even change or a buff. The slow is like very, very underrated. The only part where this is like kind of interesting is on point. But that being said, if you're on point, you generally don't want to be spamming light attacks as an SNS. It's usually better to go for heavies. With a heavy, you get that freeing justice, you get that empowering stab, you can proc like Trenchant Rend or Plague Strikes, but they're all like very, very strong abilities. But if you go for that, you can't spam light attacks. So I find this to be like a general nerf to SNS. On point, arguable, it's good because slows don't really matter as much. Off point, the Achilles heel allowed SNS to catch up to healers, made it so that healers couldn't just light dodge away. It felt like healers had to light dodge before that third attack came out, or else they would not be able to get away, and it would force them to use an ability, which you can counter by chasing with leaping strikes. So it felt like SNS is super sticky, super oppressive. This will definitely address that. I still think that this is overall like SNS is in a really good spot because Shield Rush is just a super super strong ability and everything else in the kit is just strong in general. But this nerf is a nerf. Don't mistake it as being a buff by any means. Rend is not as strong as the value it says it is. Rend in general, you could think of it as in medium, it's worth about a third of what the value says it is. In heavy, it's worth about half the value of the person that you're attacking. So if you do like 20% Rend to a heavy player, that effectively will make them take 10% more damage generally. There are exceptions to that, but that's generally what happens if they're doing an even stat split. So, Rend is not nearly as good as Empower or Weakened, and is not that strong of a debuff now, even though it's very present in the game. Like Void Gauntlet has a 30% rend, you don't really feel the difference from that in most builds. Warhammer has a 30% rend, you don't really feel the difference in that in most builds. So overall, like generally a nerf, but noteworthy. This is kind of moving on to like PvE oriented stuff and just general New World things. The Sandworm trial, they fixed an issue that caused players who died in the encounter to not receive rewards upon completion. I thought that was kind of funny at the time, but probably a good thing that they fixed that. They made legendary fishing gear easier to catch than intended before. So I guess if you see this before this patch comes out, get your legendary fishing gear now. Introduced hotkeys for gear set storage. You can now specify hotkeys that will swap your current loadout to a specific gear set storage loadout. This is really interesting because if you have like what I do with PvP right now is I have 4 loadouts. 2 of those are from free tokens I've just gotten from playing New World over time, and I just haven't bought skins. You can use those loadouts and switch them depending on the state of combat that you're in, or like depending on what you need in a specific situation. This requires you having kind of flexibility of your build and a lot of trust with the people that are leading your army. But like as a Sword and Shield player, Sword and Shield with Ice Gauntlet is good. Sword and Shield with Void Gauntlet is good. Sword and Shield with Great Sword is good. IGVG sometimes is good. Sometimes you don't want an SNS, and depending on those situations, I could switch to whatever feels the best. I think this is like generally good for me. For other classes, say you don't want to make that drastic of a change, maybe you're going from a IGVG set that has 20% slash thrust and strike resistance to one with 0%. Because I know people, or sorry, from one to 0%, like one with like a 10-10 split or something like that. Like you could change your gem setups on the fly a little bit faster using that. There's like a lot of mechanics that you can get away with the gear set system, and binding stuff to hotkeys will just make that a little bit faster. I don't think this is like hugely impactful in terms of how you play the game though, because usually when you're switching between sets, it's like after you die. You're not typically doing this during combat. But if you want to get really, really crazy with it and you don't have an ability cooldown, I believe you could change your gear set after 10 seconds of being out of combat, which is like not that long of a time. It could be, if you're like up top in the fort area, you can like pop a gear set on there. If you're running back from respawn OPR, you could swap your gear set there. Like it's very, very easy to do it. Overall, like good improvement, seems like a good quality of life thing. Fix an issue that made Artisan Fishing Pool unusable. Okay. Fix an issue that caused earned PvP XP season activity to display incorrect text. Okay, I'm not really aware of that. Fix an issue that caused season XP to award from crafting gypsums to not scale correctly when crafting multiple casts at once. That is good that they fixed that. I didn't realize that was a thing and was wasting stuff, but oh well. Fix an issue because they added a thing where you can craft multiple gypsums at the same time, so you don't have to just kind of do one at a time and wait for that long animation. So that's just a quality of life thing that they added, and they forgot to do this feature, so it makes sense. Props to the QA team for catching that one, by the way. Fix an issue that prevented players who did not earn a gear set slot through the season 1 pass from purchasing it through the store. That is an interesting bug that I wasn't aware of, but glad they fixed that. For returning players, fix an issue that caused the journey task called the Ancients to not properly record song completion. Okay. Fix an issue that caused the Horde Master boss spawn to spawn less monsters than intended. Okay. Fix an issue that caused a large gray plane visible within arena space. I wasn't aware of that, but these are just kind of like random things that are fixed that are needed to be fixed. So these are like optimizations. The thing I'm really hoping from these is like that these end up in the next division of code. It seems like a lot of the time stuff gets fixed and then it gets fixed for that branch of code, but when I do like a season 3 patch, that code's going to be coded on a different branch that isn't related to the live branch, and sometimes those changes won't migrate to that other branch. What I'm hoping that they did, which from what I've heard, I think that they do this, is they're pulling some of these changes from season 3 fixes on that branch to the season 2 branch, which basically will make it so that it's tracked later on in development, and we're not going to get the weird situation where season 2 feels a lot worse performance wise than season 1 without major changes being made to season 2 as far as we're aware of. Quest. During the Break Some Eggs quest, it's no longer necessary to travel. Okay. Fixed enemy reduced enemy health and damage in the Break Some Eggs soul trial. It just lowers the barrier of entry. It's always good. Spawn guide no longer spawns in the world. That someone left that in there and forgot to get rid of them. Removed lingering missions from old First Light as that zone is no longer accessible. Yep, that makes sense. Uh, game modes and increase the amount of personal score or increase the amount of personal score points gathered from contesting outpost rush points by 40% in outpost rush. Okay, so if you're on a point, you're gonna get more score. Sure, that makes sense. I think that one problem historically is that you need to get a score threshold to get rewards. And if you were capping points, you were not able to get that score threshold as easily as people who did not cap points, so it de-incentivized capping points. So hopefully this will combat that a bit. 3v3s, the Brimstone Stands arena has been activated because they do it every 2 weeks on a rotation. They don't have like a queue like voting RNG system yet. I kind of wish they would add that, but this is fine in the short term, I guess. Uh, this is graphics and UI. I don't think most of the stuff is worth talking about, but they have like some general fixes here. The big things are the extra con that people are going to be getting, and the 150 dex and 300 dex attribute being changed, and the detonate heart rune thing is also pretty big. So Great Sword's going to be a lot less oppressive than it was on the current patch. That being said, still probably will be good. Still is the best way to counter Ice Shower, which is still a relatively broken ability in the game. Overall, seems like it's heading in a good direction. I'm really excited for Season 3, but that seems like it's still at least a month out until we get that PTR, but very, very excited for when those changes get revealed, and overall, this is definitely heading in the right direction, and I'll see you guys later.